The gate is iron and it is closed, and the people standing in front of it know what it means to ask for it to be opened. They have not come here lightly. The street behind them, the narrow industrial street of the kind that earlier videos in this series have documented in considerable detail, continues its ordinary business at their backs. Carts moving, workers passing, the general continuous noise of an industrial city going about its day. None of that activity is available to the people standing at this gate in the way that it is available to everyone else on the street, because the activity of an industrial city requires either wages to participate in or some alternative means of support, and the people standing at this gate have exhausted both. They are here because the alternatives have run out, and the gate is the last option that remains. The Victorian workhouse, as it existed across Britain following the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 and through the decades of industrial expansion that this series has been documenting, was not designed to be a comfortable institution. This is not an incidental observation about the quality of its management or the character of the individuals who ran specific workhouses in specific towns. It is a description of the institution's deliberate design philosophy, which was developed by the legislators and administrators who created the reformed poor law system, with a specific and clearly articulated intention in mind. The workhouse was meant to be a place that no person of any means whatsoever would choose to enter voluntarily, because the system's architects believed that making institutional poor relief sufficiently unattractive would encourage the poor to seek and accept paid employment rather than institutional support, and would reserve the workhouse's resources for only those whose need was genuinely absolute. The principle was called less eligibility, and it meant that conditions inside the workhouse should be less desirable in every material and social respect than the conditions available to the lowest paid independent laborer outside it. This principle governed decisions about food, about accommodation, about labor, about family arrangement, and about the hundreds of small daily regulations that constituted the workhouse routine. Every aspect of life inside the institution was calibrated against this standard, and the calibration was generally successful in its stated aim of deterrence, which meant that the people who did eventually present themselves at the workhouse gate had typically arrived at the decision only after exhausting every other option available to them. The figure at the gate is an elderly woman, or a man whose arm was injured in a mill accident and has not healed correctly, or a widow with 3 children whose husband died of a fever contracted in the damp housing described in an earlier study, or a family whose factory closed without notice and whose savings, which were never substantial, lasted 4 weeks before running out entirely. Their individual circumstances differ in their details but share a common structure. Something has happened that removed their ability to maintain independent survival, and the period of attempting to manage that removal through their own resources and through the informal support of family and neighbors has ended. The gate opens when the porter responds to the bell. The people who have been standing in front of it step through, and the gate closes behind them, and the street on the other side of it continues its ordinary business as though nothing particular has occurred. The workhouse is not merely shelter. It is a regulated institution with its own administrative logic, its own hierarchy, its own set of rules governing nearly every aspect of daily existence, and its own carefully maintained relationship between the relief it provides and the compliance it extracts in exchange for providing it. If you haven't already, subscribe to the Sleep-Inducing Historical Archive, comment below, like, and help us to bring you more boring everyday life from the most narrow corners of history. Settle in. The gate has closed and the routine that governs everything inside it is about to begin. The decision to present at the workhouse gate does not happen suddenly in most cases, and understanding what precedes it is essential to understanding what the institution actually meant to the people who entered. An industrial wage in Victorian Britain was not a stable or guaranteed thing. It was a payment made for labor performed, contingent on the continued availability of that labor and on the continued demand for the goods or services that the labor produced. A cotton mill worker whose mill reduced its operations in response to a downturn in trade could find themselves without income in a matter of days, without any formal notice period, without any compensation for the abrupt end of their employment, and without any institutional mechanism for replacing that income while they sought alternative work. The concept of employment security in anything approaching the modern sense did not exist within the legal or commercial framework of industrial Britain in this period. Work was available when it was available, and when it was not available, the worker absorbed the consequences privately. The first response to sudden loss of income was personal and internal to the household. Whatever savings the household possessed, and for a working-class family operating on an industrial wage, savings were typically modest at best and absent at worst, were drawn upon to cover the immediate costs of rent, food, and fuel that continued regardless of whether income continued. The savings ran down at a rate determined by the gap between the household's costs and whatever reduced income remained, and they ran down faster than households typically anticipated, because the optimism that sustains any family's planning tends to assume that the situation will resolve before it actually does. When savings were exhausted, or when the household had never possessed any meaningful savings to begin with, the next resource was possessions. Furniture, clothing, tools, household equipment, anything with a resale or pawn value could be converted into cash that extended the household's ability to remain independent by days or weeks. The pawn shop, a familiar institution in working-class districts of industrial Britain, occupied an important position in this sequence of deteriorating options, providing small amounts of cash against items of modest value and charging interest rates that meant the redemption of pawned items, when it occurred at all, cost more than the original loan. Items that were not redeemed within the relevant period were sold, reducing the household's material circumstances at the same time as the underlying financial problem remained unresolved. Beyond personal resources, the informal networks of family and neighborhood that working-class communities maintained provided another layer of support that delayed rather than prevented the eventual crisis. A neighbor who could spare food, a relative with slightly more stable circumstances who could provide a loan or take in family members temporarily, a church or chapel with a small fund for cases of obvious need. These informal mechanisms of mutual support were real and were widely used, but they were not inexhaustible, particularly in communities where many households were simultaneously experiencing the same economic pressures from the same industrial downturn that had created the original problem. The shame attached to formal parish relief was substantial and deeply felt, because accepting institutional assistance was, within the value system of working-class communities in this period, an acknowledgement of failure. Not moral failure in any simple sense, but the failure of the household to maintain its independence, which was understood as the fundamental mark of respectable working-class life. A family that had managed its own affairs, paid its rent, fed its children, and required nothing from the parish occupied a social position that was distinct from and superior to a family that had become dependent on external support, regardless of the circumstances that had produced the dependency. This distinction mattered enormously to the people who lived within it, and the prospect of losing it was a significant deterrent to seeking relief, even when relief was genuinely necessary. By the time the workhouse gate was approached, all of this had already happened. The savings were gone. The possessions had been reduced to what could not be sold or pawned without making the household's immediate situation worse. The informal support of family and community had been drawn upon to the extent those resources allowed. The shame had been contemplated and finally accepted as less tolerable than the alternative, which was starvation or something close to it. The gate represented not a choice freely made, but the end of a long sequence of diminishing options, the last door in a corridor, every previous door of which had already been tried and found insufficient. The admission process begins immediately upon entering, and it begins with questions. A workhouse official, the master or a senior member of the workhouse staff, conducts the initial registration of each new applicant, recording personal details in the admission register that the workhouse is required by law to maintain: name, age, place of birth, last place of residence, occupation, reason for seeking relief, whether the applicant has previously received parish relief, and if so, where and when, whether there are family members accompanying the applicant or elsewhere. The questions are systematic and they are asked according to a standard procedure regardless of the individual circumstances of the person being questioned, because the workhouse's administrative system processes people by category rather than by individual particularity, and the information collected in this initial registration is what allows the institution to assign each new arrival to the correct category within its classification system. The answers are recorded in the register in the handwriting of the official conducting the interview, which means the permanent record of a person's entry into the workhouse is a document they have not themselves produced and may not be able to read, containing a description of their circumstances filtered through the institutional requirements of the registration process rather than through any personal account of their own situation. After registration comes inspection. The medical inspection of new arrivals served the practical purpose of identifying infectious illness before it could spread through the general population of the workhouse, and this purpose was genuine and not without value in an institution housing large numbers of people whose reduced circumstances had often included inadequate food, heating, and medical care for some period before admission. A new arrival showing signs of a contagious condition would be separated from the general admissions process and directed to the workhouse infirmary rather than to the main wards, both for their own treatment and for the protection of the existing population. The inspection also served the classification function that governed the entire institutional system. An able-bodied man of working age capable of performing physical labor represented one administrative category with specific ward assignment, specific work allocation, and specific daily routine attached to it. An elderly man physically incapable of significant labor represented a different category with different ward assignments and different routines. A woman with young children represented another category still. Each category had its designated place within the workhouse's internal geography and its designated role within the institution's daily operation. Clothing presented at admission was inspected and either cleaned and stored against the possibility of eventual discharge, or, where it was insufficient or unsuitable, replaced with the institutional clothing that identified the wearer as a workhouse inmate. The institutional garment was uniform in design across all inmates of the same sex and age category, undifferentiated without the personal details of cut, fabric, or condition that ordinary clothing accumulates over time and that ordinary clothing uses to communicate something about the person wearing it. To wear institutional clothing was to have that particular form of self-expression removed, replaced by a garment that communicated only the fact of institutional dependency and nothing further. The possessions brought in with the applicant were recorded and stored, available in theory for return upon discharge, but subject to institutional procedures that governed their handling in the interim. The removal of possessions, like the removal of personal clothing, was partly practical and partly administrative. Practical in the sense that the workhouse's internal environment required a standardization of material circumstances that personal possessions would complicate, and administrative in the sense that the institution needed to maintain control over what entered and left its premises and in what quantities. By the end of the admission process, the new inmate had been registered, inspected, classified, reclothed, and directed to a designated ward. The individual who had stood at the gate an hour earlier had been reorganized into an administrative category that the workhouse's system could process according to its established procedures. The institution had not changed the person's underlying circumstances. The injury was still unhealed. The mill was still closed. The husband was still dead. What it had done was replace the person's self-defined identity with an institutional one, organized not around who they were, but around what function they could serve within the workhouse's internal economy of labor, order, and managed survival. The family that entered the workhouse gate together does not remain together once the admission process is complete. This is perhaps the most immediately felt consequence of workhouse admission for the families who experienced it, and it was a consequence that the Poor Law's architects were fully aware of and had deliberately preserved within the system's design. The separation of family members into different wards, husbands from wives, parents from children above a certain age, siblings into the appropriate age and sex categories, was not an accidental outcome of the institutional classification system. It was a feature of that system, maintained with the same deliberate intention that governed the principle of less eligibility applied to food, accommodation, and labor. A workhouse that allowed families to remain together in their own domestic unit would be, its designers argued, too similar to ordinary domestic life to serve the deterrent function that the institution was supposed to perform. The practical arrangement within a typical Victorian workhouse divided the internal space into wards that corresponded to the classification categories established at admission. The able-bodied men's ward, the able-bodied women's ward, the boys' ward for children above a certain age, typically 7, who were considered old enough to be separated from their mothers, the girls' ward, the infirm ward, the elderly ward. Each ward had its own sleeping accommodation, its own workrooms, its own dining arrangements, and its own daily routine, and the boundaries between wards were maintained through the physical layout of the building and through the institutional regulations governing the movement of inmates within it. A husband and wife who had shared a home and a bed and the daily texture of a domestic life together for years found themselves within hours of arriving at the workhouse gate, sleeping in separate buildings or separate sections of the same building, eating in separate dining halls at separate tables, working in separate workrooms, and governed by separate sets of ward regulations that determined their daily routine without reference to each other's existence or circumstances. Contact between separated family members was controlled rather than prohibited entirely. Regulated visiting periods allowed families to see each other at specified times and in specified locations within the workhouse under supervision that prevented the kind of extended private family interaction that ordinary domestic life provided as a matter of course. A mother whose children were in the boys' and girls' wards might see them briefly at a supervised visit arranged according to the workhouse's schedule rather than according to any maternal impulse or family need. Whether the children were well, whether they were frightened, whether they were being adequately cared for by the ward staff responsible for them, these were not questions a mother could investigate freely. They were questions she could raise through the institutional channels available to her, which were limited and formal and did not guarantee a satisfactory response. The emotional weight of this separation is documented in the testimony collected by parliamentary inquiries into workhouse conditions during this period, in the accounts of reformers who visited and observed workhouses, and in the occasional personal accounts from former inmates that survived in various forms. Families who had managed to maintain their unity through the deteriorating economic circumstances that preceded workhouse admission, through the exhaustion of savings, the pawning of possessions, the reliance on neighbors and relatives, found that the institution which finally provided the survival they could no longer secure independently extracted the family unity they had maintained through all of that difficulty as one of its primary conditions of admission. The workhouse kept people alive. The cost of being kept alive within it included, for the families who entered together, the temporary and sometimes permanent dissolution of the domestic arrangements that had previously constituted ordinary life. The workhouse bell begins before sunrise without fail. The daily schedule of a Victorian workhouse was codified in the regulations issued by the Poor Law Board and maintained in each specific institution through the workhouse master's authority over the internal routine. The schedule specified the hour of rising, the sequence of washing and preparation, the times of meals, the hours of labour, the period of exercise if exercise was scheduled, the time of evening prayer if prayer was part of the institution's routine, and the hour of lights out in the sleeping wards. These times were fixed, and they did not vary according to season, to weather, to the particular needs or circumstances of any individual inmate, or to any other consideration that an inmate might regard as a reasonable basis for variation. The bell was the instrument through which the schedule was communicated, and it had the same relationship to the workhouse inmate's day that the mill bell had to the mill worker's shift. It announced transitions without requesting compliance. The rising bell did not invite inmates to consider whether they had slept adequately. The meal bell did not check whether inmates were hungry at that particular hour. The labour bell did not inquire whether inmates had the energy or the inclination for the work that the schedule now required of them. It rang, and the expected response to its ringing was movement. The correct movement in the correct direction at the correct speed for the transition the bell was announcing. Inmates moved through the workhouse's internal geography along routes that the institution's physical layout and its regulations defined. From sleeping ward to washing facilities to dining hall to workroom and back again. The daily sequence followed a path determined by the institution's spatial organization rather than by any individual's preference or convenience. The corridors, the doorways, the yards that connected different sections of the workhouse building were moved through at times and in directions governed by the schedule, and movement outside the scheduled times and directions was a violation of the regulations that governing this specific section will address in more detail. The daily schedule of the workhouse bears a structural resemblance to the shift schedule of the factory and the mill that this entire phase has been examining, and the resemblance is not entirely coincidental. Both systems use fixed time intervals marked by audible signals to regulate the movement and the activity of people who have no practical ability to opt out of the system's requirements. Both systems subordinate individual biological rhythms, hunger, fatigue, the need for particular kinds of rest and recovery at particular times, to an institutional schedule designed around the requirements of the system rather than the needs of the individual within it. Both systems are administered by a hierarchy of authority whose decisions about the schedule's design and execution are not subject to meaningful challenge from the people most directly affected by them. The difference is that the mill worker, however constrained by the economic circumstances that kept them employed in the mill, returned at the end of the shift to a domestic life that the mill did not directly regulate. The workhouse inmate's schedule continued through the evening and the night, governing sleep, governing the transition from sleeping to waking, governing the first movements of the following morning in an institution that exercised its regulatory authority over the full 24 hours of each day, rather than only the working hours that the factory claimed. The bell rang again now. The movement began again in the correct direction. The dining hall is long and the tables run its full length, and every place at the table is a place that has been assigned rather than chosen. Inmates do not select where they sit for meals any more than they select what they eat or when they eat it. The seating arrangement reflects the classification system. Men at one set of tables, women at another, children at their own tables, in whatever dining arrangement the specific workhouse's layout provides for the different wards. The arrangement ensures that the separation of the sexes and the age categories maintained in the sleeping wards and the workrooms continues through the meal, which is the only scheduled period of the day when the workhouse's internal population is gathered in a shared space in any substantial number. The meal begins with prayer in most workhouses, a brief formal acknowledgement of the institutional context within which the food is being provided before the eating begins. Silence is expected during the meal itself. Conversation between inmates during meal times was prohibited by the regulations in most workhouses. The prohibition serving the dual purpose of maintaining order in a large shared space and preventing the kind of social exchange that might allow inmates to coordinate complaints, share information about conditions in different wards, or otherwise develop the collective consciousness of their shared situation that the institution's management had reason to discourage. The food placed before each inmate was the product of a calculation rather than a culinary decision. The dietaries, the official tables specifying what each class of inmate was to be fed on each day of the week, were prescribed by the Poor Law Board and represented the outcome of considerable administrative attention to the question of how much food a workhouse inmate required to maintain the physical capacity for the labor the institution expected of them, at the minimum cost consistent with that maintenance. The goal was sufficiency, not satisfaction. Bread, gruel, a thin porridge of oatmeal boiled in water, broth, potatoes, and occasionally small amounts of cheese or cooked meat constituted the core of the workhouse dietary, the specific combination and quantity varying by class of inmate and by the day of the week according to the prescribed rotation. The portions were measured rather than served freely, which meant that the amount of food available to each inmate at each meal was a fixed quantity determined by the dietary regulations rather than by any individual assessment of that inmate's appetite or nutritional needs. An inmate who found the portion insufficient was not in a position to request more in any meaningful sense. Additional food was not routinely available, and requesting it could draw attention from the supervising staff in ways that were not necessarily advantageous. The food was meant to sustain life at the level required for labor without making the workhouse diet preferable to any available alternative. An inmate eating workhouse gruel was not being fed badly by accident. They were being fed according to a standard that had been carefully calibrated to sit below the standard that the lowest paid independent laborer in the surrounding area might expect, because if the workhouse fed its inmates better than the lowest available independent existence outside its walls, the deterrent effect of the institution on the decision to seek relief would be compromised. The bowl of gruel was not only a meal, it was a statement about the institution's position in the hierarchy of available options, communicated through the medium of food. The workhouse does not simply house its inmates, it puts them to work. This was a principle central to the Victorian poor law system's design, grounded in the belief that the provision of food and shelter to able-bodied adults without any corresponding labor requirement would create dependency rather than resolve it, and would attract to the workhouse those who were not genuinely destitute but merely unwilling to accept the employment available to them. The labor requirement served both a practical and a moral function within the institution's logic. Practical in that some of the work performed by inmates contributed to the workhouse's own operational costs, and moral in the sense that being required to work for one's food and shelter was considered a more appropriate arrangement for an able-bodied adult than being fed and housed without such a requirement. The specific tasks assigned to inmates varied by sex, age, physical capacity, and the particular workhouse's operational needs and available equipment. Able-bodied men were typically assigned to the heaviest physical labor the institution required: stone breaking, where the inmate sat in a small yard cell breaking a specified quantity of stones to a specified size using a hammer, the broken stone being used for road construction or sold to generate income for the workhouse, bone crushing, where animal bones were processed into fertilizer, or general maintenance and construction work within and around the workhouse premises. The stone-breaking task in particular had a deliberately deterrent quality, being not only hard physical labor, but also entirely unskilled and entirely without creative interest, designed to be exactly as unpleasant as its functional requirements dictated without being physically impossible for an adult in reasonable health. Women's labour in the workhouse was organised around the domestic maintenance of the institution itself, laundry for the entire establishment, which in a large workhouse represented a continuous and physically demanding operation, cooking and kitchen work, cleaning and maintenance of the wards and common areas, and needlework, including the production and repair of the institutional clothing that all inmates wore. These tasks were both functionally necessary to the workhouse's operation and consistent with the domestic labour roles that working-class women in this period were expected to perform outside the institution, which meant they were also tasks for which the institution's demand was essentially unlimited. Children above the minimum working age were assigned lighter tasks appropriate to their size and developing capacity, picking oakum, which involved the separation of old tarred rope into its individual fibres with bare hands, a tedious and slow task that damaged the fingertips after extended practice, carrying and sorting lighter materials, assisting with cleaning, or whatever other tasks the specific workhouse's management considered appropriate for child inmates. The workhouse also had a legal obligation to provide some form of schooling for its child inmates during this period, which meant that a portion of the children's day was theoretically allocated to instruction, though the quality and extent of that instruction varied considerably between institutions and was not always the priority that the legal obligation nominally made it. The elderly and the infirm were assigned whatever lighter tasks their physical capacity allowed, knitting, simple sorting, tasks that could be performed while seated and that required little physical exertion. The institution did not exempt people from the labour requirement because of age or infirmity. It adjusted the nature of the labour to match the capacity available, which was a form of consideration that did not translate into anything resembling genuine accommodation of the individual's circumstances. The sleeping ward occupies a long room, and the beds within it are arranged in rows. This is the image of the Victorian workhouse that registers most immediately as a visual expression of institutional management. The identical beds placed at identical intervals along identical rows, each one separated from the next by the minimum space consistent with the ability to enter and leave it, each one furnished with the minimum bedding consistent with the occupant remaining warm enough to sleep. The room is designed for a specific number of beds, and that number of beds is present, arranged according to a layout that maximizes the use of the available floor area while maintaining the supervisory sightlines that allow a staff member standing at one end of the ward to observe the full length of it. Each inmate sleeping in this ward arrived at their bed by the same process, directed to it by the ward staff at lights out, not having chosen it from among alternatives, not having any established claim to this particular bed over any other bed in the room beyond the institutional assignment made at classification. The bed is not theirs in any meaningful sense. It is the bed they have been assigned, and the assignment reflects administrative convenience rather than individual preference. Personal space in the sleeping ward is defined by the width of the bed and the immediate floor area beside it, and is subject to the same institutional regulation as every other space within the workhouse. Personal possessions, already substantially reduced by the admission process, are further constrained by the limited storage available at each bed position. A small box, a hook, whatever the specific ward's furniture allows. These are the physical boundaries of the private space available to each inmate during the sleeping hours. The ward contains people who did not know each other before admission and who share this sleeping space by virtue of belonging to the same institutional category rather than by any personal connection or mutual choice. The intimacy of sleeping in the same room as strangers in the close quarters of a dormitory ward is imposed rather than chosen. Another form of the enforced proximity that characterized working-class life in the industrial housing districts outside the workhouse, but without the mediating factor of shared neighborhood identity or long-term acquaintance that made the physical closeness of back-to-back housing at least familiar. The nights in the sleeping ward are not without disturbance. A large room of people sleeping together contains the coughs and the movements and the occasional sounds of distress from a population that includes the elderly, the ill, the frightened, and those experiencing the particular grief of people who have recently lost their independence and their family arrangements simultaneously. None of these disturbances can be managed with the normal domestic strategies of separate rooms, private spaces, or personal autonomy over one's own sleeping environment, because the sleeping ward does not provide any of those things. The morning begins when the bell rings. The beds are vacated and made according to the institutional standard, not as each person naturally makes a bed, but as the workhouse regulation specifies it should be made. The sleeping ward is the night's expression of managed survival. It shelters, it does not restore. The workhouse regulations governing inmate behavior ran to considerable length and addressed a range of conduct that would strike any observer as extending well beyond what the institution's basic functional requirements would seem to demand. Inmates were prohibited from talking during meals. They were prohibited from leaving their assigned ward without authorization. They were prohibited from communicating with inmates of other wards without the permission of the ward staff. They were prohibited from damaging institutional property, from refusing to perform the work assigned to them, from being in possession of food outside of meal times, from making excessive noise in the sleeping wards, from behaving in ways that the master or matron considered disruptive to the institution's order. The regulations specified not only what was prohibited, but the process through which violations were to be reported, investigated, and punished, establishing a formal disciplinary system that paralleled the institution's administrative system for classification and routine management. Minor violations of the regulations were addressed through graduated penalties that did not require the involvement of external authority. A reduction in the dietary allowance, being fed less than the already minimal prescribed ration for a period, was among the more commonly applied punishments for lower-level infractions. Confinement to a specific area of the ward, removal of whatever small privileges the institution allowed, additional labor requirements beyond the standard daily assignment. These were available to the workhouse master as responses to conduct that violated the regulations without rising to the level of a formal disciplinary hearing. More serious violations or repeated violations of lesser rules could result in formal proceedings before the workhouse's Board of Guardians, the committee of elected local officials responsible for the workhouse's governance. These proceedings were administrative rather than criminal in nature, but they had the capacity to produce outcomes that significantly affected the inmate's circumstances: extended confinement, referral to a magistrate for conduct that constituted a criminal offense under the relevant legislation, or in some cases transfer to a different institution better equipped to handle persistent non-compliance. What the regulations actually produced in most cases, however, was not formal disciplinary proceedings, but the more pervasive and more continuous behavioral modification that comes from living within a rule system that is always present and always potentially active. Inmates who had been in the workhouse for any length of time learned the regulations thoroughly, not because they were formally instructed in them, although the regulations were typically posted in accessible locations within the institution, but because the consequences of violating them were sufficiently real and sufficiently immediate that practical knowledge of what was permitted and what was not became a basic survival skill within the institution. The result was a general behavioral compliance that was maintained less by the active enforcement of specific rules than by the inmates' internalized awareness that the rules existed and that violations had consequences. A person who knew that talking during meals could result in a reduced dietary allowance generally did not talk during meals, not because they were physically prevented from doing so, but because the calculation of potential cost against potential benefit produced a consistent outcome in favor of silence. The discipline of the workhouse worked for the most part through this internalized calculation rather than through any dramatic or continuous exercise of physical authority. Bring together everything that the previous sections of this study have established, and the shape of what the workhouse actually was becomes clear. It was not simply a building that housed the destitute. It was a system, a coordinated arrangement of admission procedures, classification categories, architectural spaces, daily schedules, dietary regulations, labor requirements, sleeping arrangements, and behavioral rules, designed to manage poverty as an administrative problem rather than to address it as a human condition. The system's components were not accidental accumulations of institutional practice. They were designed elements, revised through successive iterations of poor law administration, each one refined in response to what the previous iteration had revealed about how poverty presented itself and how the institution could most efficiently process and contain it. The system kept people alive. This was its primary and undeniable function, and it performed that function in a period when the alternative for those without means to support themselves was genuinely lethal in many cases. An elderly person with no surviving family and no savings, a widow with young children and no employment, a man permanently disabled by an industrial accident. The workhouse provided these people with the food and shelter that their circumstances could not otherwise supply, and in this bare functional sense it represented a form of social provision that a society entirely without it would have been considerably harsher. But the system's method of keeping people alive required, as its operating condition, that they surrender to the institution's authority over nearly every aspect of their daily existence. The schedule was the institution's schedule. The food was the institution's food, served in the institution's quantities at the institution's times. The work was the institution's work, assigned according to the institution's classification of each inmate's capacity and usefulness. The sleeping arrangements were the institution's arrangements, in the institution's beds, in rooms shared with people the institution had placed there. The family relationships that had constituted the inmate's most fundamental social identity before admission were reorganized around the institution's classification system, the family's physical proximity and daily contact governed by the institution's ward structure rather than by the family's own wishes. The dependency that the workhouse's name implied was not a temporary condition awaiting resolution. For many inmates, the elderly, the chronically ill, the permanently disabled, the workhouse was not a transitional institution providing support until independent circumstances could be restored. It was the permanent arrangement within which the remainder of their lives would be organized, a fact that the institution's designers had anticipated and had accommodated within its classification and operational systems without significantly altering the fundamental character of the institution's relationship to those it housed. The workhouse connected to the wider industrial society that surrounded it in a relationship that was less incidental than it appeared. The irregular wages, the dangerous machinery, the overcrowded housing, the periodic unemployment, and the insecurity of working-class life in industrial Britain that this entire series has been documenting, these were the conditions that produced the workhouse's population. The people who stood at the gate were, in many cases, people who had worked in the mills and foundries, lived in the housing districts, breathed the air, and navigated the systems that the earlier episodes described. The workhouse was where that system deposited people when they could no longer remain inside it as functioning components. It prevented starvation. It demanded, in exchange for preventing it, the surrender of the independence, the family unity, the personal identity, and the daily autonomy that constituted ordinary life outside its walls. The gate that opened to let people in closed behind them with the same iron certainty that had characterized every other system this series has examined. Organized, regulated, indifferent to the individual circumstances of the people it processed, and entirely confident in its own necessity. The bell has rung for the last time tonight, and the ward has gone quiet. You remain a moment in the corridor outside, the institutional gaslight burning low at the far end, the rows of identical beds just visible through the open doorway, the building settling into whatever version of silence a place filled with this many people ever achieves. Nothing about tomorrow will be different from today. The schedule does not change. These are the systems that kept people alive by making survival a managed condition, organized down to the bowl, the bed, and the bell, and offered in exchange for everything that ordinary life had previously been. If you'd like to return, the archive is, as always, open.